Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Zia Mian, and I'm here in the Woodrow Wilson School, where I direct the project on peace and security in South Asia. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Shuja Nawaz. Shuja Nawaz is the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Before joining the council in 2009, he published what is now widely regarded as the most important history so far of the Pakistan Army. The book is called Crossed Swords, Pakistan, Its Army and the Wars Within, was published by Oxford University Press in 2008. And it's based on extraordinary access to the Pakistan Army and a lifetime of research and thinking about the army and its role in Pakistan's politics and its relationship to Pakistani society. And at a time when we're all so concerned about the future of Pakistan and what it means for the rest of the world, the book offers real insights into a really important institution. Pakistan's army, for those of you who don't follow it too closely, has ruled the country for 30 of its past 60 years and is determined to continue to be a major player under any democratic dispensation in that country. Its role will be critical in the foreseeable future in deciding how Pakistan copes with its crisis of governance, with the Islamist militancy, with the really serious economic crisis that Pakistan is in the middle of, and of course, dealing with the challenges created by the catastrophic floods earlier this year, which may have very long-term social and political implications for the future of the country. So Shuja Nawaz has been thinking about and interpreting and explaining Pakistan and its problems for many years, including to Pakistanis. He started out his career as a newscaster and reporter and producer for Pakistan television in the late 1960s. And during that time, he actually covered the 1971 war between Pakistan and India. And so he's seen Pakistan under its first military dictatorship of General Ayub Khan, which led to a massive revolt, civil war, and then a real war with India. That was also the time where Pakistan built its first really close political and military relationship with the United States, during which the United States poured vast amounts of military equipment, training, money, economic aid, development projects into Pakistan as a way to buy Pakistan's support, and especially the army's support in the Cold War. So many of the things that we see today, we've seen before in a slightly different guise. And Shuja is well placed to interpret both the historical experience and the contemporary experience and explain how this dynamic is likely to play out in the future. In recent years, he's been working as a political and strategic analyst for a number of think tanks in the United States, and he's in great demand as somebody who can help people understand the problems facing Pakistan. And to my great pleasure, he is now compelled to have to find answers to some of those problems. So please join me in welcoming Shuja Nawaz as a speaker.
Thank you very much, Zia, and it's always a pleasure to be here. I remember the last time I came, we had a really fantastic discussion, and particularly the questions afterwards. So I hope that I can try and cover the topic in a reasonable amount of time so that we can then have a chance for a conversation. Just before we began this session, I was talking to an old friend who's in the audience, and he asked me if I was going to provide any cheerful news. And I said, perhaps not. But then in the discussion, when Zia arrived, it was a question of, is the glass half full or half empty? And a friend of ours, Sir Hilary Sinnott, who used to be a British High Commissioner in Pakistan, and who actually was, before he became a diplomat, was trained as an engineer, said that from an engineering perspective, the right question is the glass too big? And so that's really one of the conundrums, when you're facing a situation looking at Pakistan. In one way, and this is not because I'm a Pakistani, but when I look at the country, I see one of the most resilient countries on the face of the earth. If you look at what the country's had to go through in 63 years of existence. At the same time, it is perhaps one of the most unluckiest countries on the face of the earth, again for the same reasons. It has been beset by both natural and man-made disasters. And the man-made disasters, Zia alluded to in some ways, was a very dysfunctional political system and a polity that has given rise to a political system today that could only be characterized as a series of family businesses. So almost all the leading parties in Pakistan today are essentially dynastic family businesses. And ironically, the only political party that actually holds elections from the ward level up is the Islamic Party, the Jamaat-e-Islami. Almost every other single major party is in some family's possession, and the leadership is handed down, as was the case with the Pakistan People's Party of Benazir Bhutto, where her son and her husband received the ownership of the party as co-chairs. So these are kind of some of the background issues that affect Pakistan's polity and disable it in many ways from becoming as vibrant a democracy as the people of Pakistan want it to be. And I differentiate between the rulers and the people because each time the country goes to the polls, people actually come out and vote. They want to vote. They want to express their views. And they're always ready, willing, and able to deliver a change when it's needed through the ballot box, when they're given that opportunity. But as Zia alluded, actually, directly or indirectly, the military has ruled Pakistan for 38 years. So that's a pretty long time. And some of them have been very extended periods, like Ayub Khan, and then Ziaul Haq, and then President Musharraf most recently. And each time the military stays for a long time, it eviscerates the bureaucracy, eviscerates the constitution, the legal system, and society generally. And the civil service is now really a shadow of its former self. So there isn't much for a civilian government to work with when it comes back to power. What I was going to do was divide my comments into two sections, and then you will see that there is a nexus between the two. One is looking at domestic issues which put Pakistan in the eye of the storm. And I'm going to, instead of taking the long historical view, look at some of the more recent issues because those are the ones that will see us through to the next year or two and maybe beyond. As I said, the government today is a civilian government that inherited power after the resignation of President Musharraf. It is led by the Pakistan People's Party, but it's a Pakistan People's Party that did not receive the majority of the votes of the population that voted in the elections in 2008. And so as a result, they had to essentially buy support from a host of other parties. And so you have a very dysfunctional coalition which is unable to make decisions. And so it's politics, not policies, that is the rule of the day. Till recently, something like 83 persons had a cabinet rank, which meant that they weren't all ministers, but they were given cabinet ranks and perks and privileges in order that the coalition could stay together. The other issue is that the relationship between the center and the provinces continues to bedevil Pakistan's politics. Pakistan came together constitutionally as a federation, so essentially the provinces were supposed to have the power and then were to give power to the center in order to keep the country together. As a result, primarily of military rule and civilian autocratic rule, power started shifting to Islamabad. And so the provinces gradually lost their ability to govern themselves. And most important of all, they lost the fiscal autonomy that was a very necessary part of any federation. And so even when President Musharraf introduced his much vaunted local government, the key ingredient that was missing from that local government was fiscal responsibility. They couldn't raise taxes, they couldn't use revenues the way they wanted to. Everything had to be approved from the center. And so when he was replaced, the new government came in and basically abandoned the local government practice. But, and here is the good news, under some of the reforms that have been introduced, particularly following the discussions on the National Finance Commission Award, this is a rather boring title, but it really addresses the heart of the relationship between the center and the periphery in Pakistan. The central government voluntarily agreed to cede a number of powers that had been taken away from the provinces back to the provinces. And as a follow-up to that, within the next month, the Prime Minister has now promised that the federal cabinet is going to be pared down and probably will lose 10 ministries because those ministries and those responsibilities properly belong to the provinces. The problem that they face now is that having atrophied, the provincial governments and administrations are not yet ready to take on these powers. Accompanying this National Finance Award was a very key piece of legislation that was agreed to but hasn't been passed or implemented, which was for a nationwide value-added tax. This was seen as a counterweight to a problem that persists in Pakistan. Because the government is quite often seen as corrupt and not meeting the needs of the people by providing essential services, people in Pakistan do not like to pay income tax. So out of a population of 180 million, I should say people in America don't like to pay income tax too, but they do. In Pakistan, the only people that actually pay income tax are the salaried classes because it's deducted at source. Out of a population of 180 million, the total income tax rolls are 2 million, and that's it. So the VAT was seen as a panacea of some kind, that it would provide resources to the center and to the provinces, and that this would be equitably distributed, and that the government would then have enough resources. But there was so much opposition to it that in the end, they transmogrified the VAT into an enhanced general sales tax. And so there is something called the Reformed General Sales Tax, RGST, that as we speak is now being presented to Parliament for approval. Why? Because the Cabinet couldn't agree on taking a decision. This is the result of having a dysfunctional coalition government. So there's a good news, bad news mixture there. The idea is that they are on the right path. The bad news is, are they going to be able to implement the right things that they've agreed to, and which now the international community, like my former place of employment, the International Monetary Fund, is really pushing them to do. Because if they don't, within the next couple of months, Pakistan is going to face a very serious financial crisis. And inflation is already shooting up, the rupee is falling, and money will start leaving Pakistan in a rush, as it did in February 2008. And when that happens, the international community, and particularly the IMF, is not going to have the resources, the 8 or 10 billion that Pakistan will need to get it out of its hole. So, mark my words, within the next 2 months, unless the government acts, they're going to face a very serious crisis, and they'll be at the mercy of international and domestic forces. The problem with economic decision-making is not that they don't have the brains. The government actually has now put together one of the best economic teams. They have a finance minister with international recognition and experience. They have a head of the planning commission with international experience and recognition. They have a head of the state bank somebody who is a technocrat, who has served in provincial governments before, and who's been trained abroad, who's an economist and a chartered accountant both. So they have the teams. The problem occurs at the level of the cabinet, the prime minister, and the presidency. Now, one of the things that the government did, which was much lauded, was the passing of what's known as the 18th Amendment, under which the powers that had been taken away by President Musharraf from Parliament and the Prime Minister and arrogated onto the presidency reverted back to the Prime Minister and to Parliament. Unfortunately, because the President, even though he's shorn of his constitutional powers, continues to be the President of the People's Party, the Prime Minister is essentially one of his acolytes or servants. And so the Prime Minister cannot act on his own volition. And the Prime Minister is facing opposition from within the party continuously. So he's being attacked on two fronts and will not take any action that puts him at risk. So the whole policy stance of the government appears to be, yet again, an attempt at muddling through at a time when Pakistan really cannot afford to muddle through. So we've talked about the economic situation. Underlying the difficulties of Pakistan economically and politically is a raging insurgency. And this was an insurgency that was homegrown in a reaction to the very rapid acquiescence on the part of President Musharraf to move the Pakistan Army into the federally administered tribal area, the buffer zone between Pakistan and Afghanistan. This was at the request of the United States in an attempt to try and seal the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, a border that cannot be sealed. And if only we had looked back at our own history as well as the history of the Soviet misadventure in Afghanistan, this was something that is quite obvious. For those of you that are expert in the ways of the Soviets and those that are interested in that history, I would recommend looking at a five-page minute of the November 1986 Politburo meeting at which Gorbachev got the Politburo to agree to a timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan 2 years later. So November 86, and the discussion is fascinating for a number of reasons. One, because of the quality of the discussion. There isn't the kind of anecdotal stuff that you see in Bob Woodward's book on Obama's wars or Bush's wars. There's very serious discussion based on facts. And at one point, Gorbachev says to Akromiev, "You asked for 50,000 troops. I gave you 50,000 troops. You said you wanted to seal the border with Pakistan. The border is wide open. You asked me for another 50,000 troops. If I give them to you, I assure you the border will be open. Just look at the mountains, the passes, the tracks, and you know that you can't close it." And then at another point he says, there is no hill or valley in Afghanistan that we haven't conquered many times before. And so if you remove the names and replace them with the current names, you see almost a high-level discussion at the NSC in the White House. And so it was against that backdrop that Musharraf immediately promised, in lieu of money, the coalition support funds, and in order to keep himself in power and become from a pariah to a darling of the West, agreed to send in the Pakistan Army into this buffer zone from where they had been taken out in 1947 after independence, in order to show the Pakhtuns that this was not a colonial army, that the Brits had put the troops in there in Waziristan and Khyber and other places. The Pakistan Army was not going to be camped in the tribal areas. Well, this created a backlash. And the backlash spawned something called the Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan. And the Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan has been trying to establish control not only in Fatah, but through association with other militant groups in the settled area of what used to be the Northwest Frontier Province. And at one point, according to all the clamor in the Western press, was 60 miles from Islamabad when they took over key districts of the Swat Malakand division. Well, the Pakistan Army was seen as an alien force in Fatah. And they regarded themselves as an alien force for good reason, because the army represents the population of Pakistan, and the largest single province is the Punjab. And the language of the Punjab is Punjabi, and the language of the Fatah is Pashto. And they couldn't even speak to the locals. And they made a serious error in going in by sending in the troops that were stationed in the periphery of Fatah, from Peshawar all the way down to Bannu and Kohat and Dera Ismail Khan. And these were the troops that are traditionally deployed for fighting against India and Kashmir. So there was a serious error in sending those troops that didn't know the terrain and didn't know the language. Whereas there's a pretty powerful element in the Pakistan Army that has regiments that are 50% Pashto, 50% Punjabi. And the Punjabis have to learn Pashto in order to function in those regiments. If they had only taken a little time and said, okay, let's identify those units and send them in, and they can then explain to people why they're there. So they lost that initial opportunity of actually winning over the locals, and they could have quelled this insurgency when it was at its early stages. Instead, the insurgency has grown. It has taken on the Pakistan military. It is now aligned with Punjabi militant groups that were once trained by the Inter-Services Intelligence to fight against India and Kashmir. And they are now a very potent force. This is predominantly a Sunni group, so they've become part of the sectarian warfare inside Pakistan. In the Fatah, there's a Quram agency which is divided between the Shia and the Sunni, and the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is also associated with the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba and other similar groups, and these are all Sunni militant groups, have entered the battle against the Shia and Quram agency. They're also now operating in Quetta and Balochistan. I was there in April, and literally the day after I was wandering Jinnah Avenue, the next day there was a bomb blast on the same street, killing 43 people. It was meant to eliminate a Shia leader and the people that came to mourn him when he was taken into the hospital on his deathbed. So this is the kind of witch's cauldron that is brewing inside Pakistan as a result of this insurgency. Just a word about the Punjabi militancy, because there is now some attention being paid to it. I think there was a missed opportunity on the part of President Musharraf. When he made overtures towards India to try and resolve some differences with them, and got very close to resolving issues such as Siachen, such as the water conflict, and Sir Creek, which is a godforsaken piece of land in the south of the country, but important because if it is treated as a river, then the line through it is drawn at a certain angle. If it's treated as an estuary, then the line is drawn at a different angle, and that line then extends to the Arabian Sea and affects the economic zone of Pakistan in the Arabian Sea. So he was quite close to solving these three issues and had reached an understanding with Manmohan Singh on Kashmir, that it would be allowed to settle down and evolve on its own, but it wouldn't be a bone of contention and not active hostility. At that point, he basically pushed these Punjabi militant groups back and said, no more, we don't want your services. There was an opportunity to actually have a de-weaponization program, bringing in money from the Saudis and the US and whoever else wanted to help, to buy back the money, the weapons from these groups, to retrain them, to bring their families into a de-radicalization program. None of this was done. They were simply let go, and much like the samurai in Japanese history, then they were warriors for hire. And they had by that time established a financial base for themselves. They were raising funds internally, and they were raising funds from the Gulf states and from Saudi Arabia, from private sources. So they are now a very major force, and they're in the heart of the country. And this is the group that has now a trans-regional and a global view. And if any group is poised to take over the role of Al-Qaeda on the global stage, it is this group, the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, in alliance with Simi in India and Huji, which is the Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh, an import of an idea from Pakistan. So the army now is basically a very powerful position in Fatah with 150,000 troops. It has not yet acted against the Haqqani group because there it sees the Haqqanis as not being against Pakistan and not actively against the army. It also sees the Haqqanis as a way to have an influence in whatever emerges in Afghanistan after the coalition departs. And this hedging strategy hasn't changed on the part of the ISI or of the military. The army itself, a word about it, has changed dramatically. It's changed because it came under attack from the insurgency. And so, although they refuse to use the word counterinsurgency, they still use low-intensity conflict. Within the last 2 years, they have dramatically changed their entire training regimen. So recently, I've just completed completing a study on counterinsurgency experience in Pakistan. And I call it learning by doing, because they've basically been rotating their forces in and out of the fight. So maximum number of officers and soldiers are now exposed to this kind of warfare. They've revived all the training that the British Indian Army had for what was then called Indian frontier warfare. That had all been forgotten. And they've learned a lot from the counterinsurgency experience and the mistakes made in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And so within 2 years, they have completely revamped the curriculum at the Pakistan Military Academy, where officers go for initial training, at the School of Infantry and Tactics, and at the Staff College. I spent time at all these institutions with the instructors, with the students, in the classes, in the field, and it is completely transformed. No longer do they have war games in which there's red land and fox land and blue land and, so India-Pakistan kind of warfare. They now have actually a profile of a mullah, a bearded mullah, and they talk about the thinking behind this insurgency and how to work with the local population and so on. The missing link in this is the civil-military nexus. And that is because the military still lacks confidence in the civilian side, and the civilians have missed every opportunity to miss an opportunity. They decided to set up a national counterterrorism authority. They brought in one of the brightest young police officers, brought him out of retirement because they retired at an early age, and put him in the Ministry of Interior. And the minister refused to allow him to function, refused to give him any resources. And as a result, this summer he resigned. And so the bill that was going to go to the Parliament to set up the National Counterterrorism Authority is still sitting with the government. So what they don't understand, which is the lesson from all counterinsurgency campaigns that have succeeded around the globe, is that it's not the military that wins the counterinsurgency, it's always the civilians and the police. And until and unless they concentrate on that nexus in planning military operations, and once the clear, hold, build occurs, then the transfer can take place. There are some attempts at that in Swat and Malakand now, but it's mainly transferred to NGOs rather than to the civilians. I was there and I've seen how the military set up schools and other institutions. And one of the best things, good news, Ray, they actually planted 1 million trees in Swat, Malakand. And this brings me to the next issue, which is the floods. Because it was a natural disaster, and yet it was a man-made disaster. It was a man-made disaster because the government has allowed deforestation, and it has allowed habitation of riverbeds, which, because of scarcity of water, created land which was then occupied by landlords as well as peasants, and they moved and started living in this fertile, well-silted plains around the Indus Basin. And of course, floods happen every year, and this year they were particularly bad. And because there was no vegetation in the upper catchment areas, the water just came down. And as a result, you have an area the size of the eastern seaboard, which was affected by the floods, and 20 million people were either homeless or otherwise affected. And the effects of this are going to be felt for quite some time, because the reason is this is a very sharp divide between the rural and urban population of Pakistan. All the people affected by the floods are the rural poor, and they've lost their livestock. And livestock is really the lifeblood for them, because an interesting fact, I'm not sure people are aware, but the largest single element in Pakistan's agricultural production in terms of value is buffalo milk. It accounts for $10 billion a year of income, which keeps people alive. They produce milk from it, they sell the milk, they produce butter, they eat it, they sell it. And wheat and rice and all the other things are a third of that. So comparatively, and we've lost well over 1.5 million livestock. And so it's going to be very difficult for these people, even if they go back and rebuild their homes, to recreate that lost livestock. And even importing that vast a number, where would you get them from? So this is something that is going to seriously affect Pakistani politics. The other thing that's going to affect Pakistani politics is they now plan to have the census next year. It was supposed to occur this year. When the census occurs, Pakistan will be seen as a predominantly urban population, a country with a predominantly urban population. And under the Constitution, you then have to redraw the political boundaries for election to the National Assembly and to the Provincial Assembly. When you do that, the power of the votes in the countryside is going to diminish relative to the cities. And so Karachi, which has 18 million population, is going to have a huge number of seats in the National and the Provincial Assembly. That's going to affect the way the government is formed, the way Parliament acts, and the kinds of pressures that will be on how to deliver to the people that voted you in. So this is going to be something to look out for in the next 2 or 3 years. Economically, the Prime Minister of Pakistan said that the total cost of the flood was roughly about $43 billion for Pakistan. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank did a study that was released on October 15th, and they came in with a direct damage assessment of infrastructure, particularly of 9.7 billion. The problem is not the gap between 9.7 and 43 billion. The problem is the gap between 9.7 and the 2 billion that the UN was trying to raise for Pakistan. Less than a third of it has actually been collected. And just this week, the Pakistan Development Forum took place in Islamabad, and the United States basically has been recycling the same Kerry Lugar money for the last 2 years. They were promising that when Kerry Lugar is approved, this money will be online. And now they've said 500 million of the 1.5 billion of the first year's allocation will be given for flood relief. Too little, too late. I think this is going to be a serious issue which will affect the relationship between the US and Pakistan. That takes me to the international external factors in Pakistan. The first one, of course, remains India. India remains not just a problem, but a fantastic opportunity for Pakistan, in my view. India is going to be the center of gravity of the world economy. It is going to be a very powerful military and political power. And Pakistan has to understand the reality of that situation and look for a very different kind of power base for itself, an economic power base, looking less to the east for competition and more to the west into Central Asia for markets and so on. But India also offers an opportunity, because if trade between Pakistan and India, which is currently a measly 1.8 billion a year, accounts for 1% of India's exports or trade with Pakistan, and 5% of Pakistan's total trade goes to India. So instead of the 1.8 billion trade with India and a 3 billion indirectly through Dubai and maybe $1.5 billion through Singapore, if they were to revert to normal trading relations using the gravity model that occurred at the time of partition in 1947, when 70% of the trade of the areas that are now Pakistan and India were with each other, you would have a range of $43 to $100 billion worth of trade between the two countries. The GNP effects of this would be fantastic. Calculation by Shahid Javed Berkey. By the way, these figures that I cited are from Mohsin Khan's work at the Peterson Institute. But Berkey's calculations indicate that Pakistan would have a net increase of $875 per capita as a result of this increased trade. And India, with its much larger population, would have a net increase of $1,245 or thereabouts. So there's an opportunity there. The question is, are the leaders on both sides going to be able to come together on it? Prime Minister Manmohan Singh is probably the last best hope to get this done in the near future, because who knows what will replace him. On Afghanistan, we talked about the hedging strategy. I think there's a very serious need for Pakistan, and particularly the military and particularly the ISI, which reports predominantly to the military now because of the direct relationship between the army chief, General Kiani, and General Pasha, the head of the ISI. They need to rethink the way they look at Afghanistan. Traditionally, Pakistan has always looked at Afghanistan as some kind of a younger brother, a junior partner in the relationship, because Pakistan saw itself as more advanced, developed, and also because Pakistan controlled all the trade routes in and out of Afghanistan. They made a serious error, in my view, at the time of the Soviet invasion by focusing attention solely on the Pashtun tribes that were contiguous to Pakistan. And they ignored the Tajiks and the Hazara and the Uzbeks and the Shia in the western part of the country. Now I think it may be time to rethink that strategy and to broaden the base, not because India is very active in the Northern Alliance territories, but because it's very critical for Afghans to see that Pakistan regards them as an equal. The reality is that Afghanistan was a country for almost 200 years. Pakistan's only been a country for 63 years. So I think some respect needs to be shown to the neighbor, from where many of us came. Population of Pakistan and a large part of northern India are descendants of people that were originally from Afghanistan. So there is a time to rethink. One of the rays of hope occurred last year. I was at the National Defense University, and the Army Chief, General Kiani, was visiting. And in his speech, he said, "I want to talk about strategic depth." And I shuddered a bit because in my own work and in my commentary, I regard this term as being completely outmoded and anachronistic and a wrong interpretation of Pakistan's strategic needs. And this was actually introduced by General Aslam Beg in the late 1980s and early 1990, 91, and supported by his ISI chief, General Hamid Gul, who continued to favor this approach. And in brief, the approach was that if India ever attacked Pakistan in occupied territory, Pakistan and its forces could escape to Iran and Afghanistan. And this would give them the physical strategic depth that they needed to continue the fight. Now, anyone who's seen the map of Pakistan knows that if India were to come in 15, 20, 30 miles, they would be occupying the major cities of Pakistan, Lahore, Sialkot, Gujranwala. They would break the country in many parts, and the game would be over, regardless of whether you escape to Afghanistan or Uzbekistan, it wouldn't matter. So General Kiani said he wanted to talk about strategic depth, but he said, let me redefine strategic depth. And his definition of strategic depth was, and I'm paraphrasing him, a stable, prosperous Afghanistan that is in no way posing any threat to Pakistan by harboring any element that would be a threat to the integrity of Pakistan. This was an indirect reference to India. It was also an indirect reference to some Baloch insurgents that continue to find a home in Kabul. So there is now some movement occurring. There's also another important external element which is critical for Pakistan's economy and polity. Traditionally, the fair weather friend for Pakistan has been China. And unfortunately, this is one of the least nurtured friendships in history, because neither side has really done an awful lot to keep it going. And Pakistan in particular has taken China for granted. So the Chinese have now started returning the favor. They basically have no confidence in the political government that currently exists. Even in response to requests for assistance, they've been niggardly. And when they have given assistance, it has been in the form of technology parks and investments that they've made in Pakistan, rather than budgetary assistance, which is what Pakistan needed. The Saudis had the same approach, and the only reason why they came up in the Friends of Democratic Pakistan to support Pakistan's needs was because Kuwait came in first, and the Saudis obviously didn't want to be left out. And more recently, at the insistence, particularly of the army chief, they have given money to Pakistan for flood relief. But that money has not been given to the government. It has gone through the United Nations. So there is a difference in that relationship, and it continues to haunt the civilian government in Pakistan today. Finally, let's talk about the US-Pakistan relationship. Ziya referred to the ups and downs of this relationship going back to the 50s and 60s and 70s. It's almost with the regularity of a business cycle. And if you juxtapose on this up and down curve the flow of aid from the United States to Pakistan, and then juxtapose on it the type of government that Pakistan has, the maximum amount of US aid that has gone to Pakistan has been when there's been a military ruler. And this administration has tried to change that dialogue and that narrative by saying that we will deal with the people of Pakistan, we will have a longer-term commitment. And Kerry Lugar, which actually preceded this administration, but used to be the Biden-Lugar-Obama bill, because that's what the president insists, he was a co-sponsor, was meant to do that. 5 years of aid, perhaps another 5 years of aid if things go well. The problem is that the deep distrust and the lack of convergence on their objectives for the region, and now a burgeoning US-Indian relationship, a recognition of India as a civil nuclear power, ignoring Pakistan's pleas to be considered at least on the same level on the nuclear issue, not dealing with the issue of market access for Pakistani goods, where 14 other countries, including leading countries of Europe, pay less duty on their exports to the United States than Pakistan does. There's just been complete inaction in Congress on this score, which further fuels the Pakistani conspiracy theorists that the US really has some ulterior motives. We don't know what, but they must be thinking something dastardly for Pakistan. And as a result, every time the opinion polls take place, the US is seen as the greatest enemy in Pakistan, 59% according to the Pew poll. The good news, if any, on that poll was that 64% of Pakistanis want a good relationship with the United States. So there is some hope if somehow you can win their confidence. It reminds me of a quote from General Ziaul Haq. He was talking to Ambassador Jamshid Markar, our ambassador in Washington, and he said being friends with the United States is like living on the banks of a great river. Every 4 years, it changes course, and you're either left flooded or high and dry. And so I'll stop there, and I hope that you have questions, and I hope that I have some answers for you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Would you mind saying just a little bit more about the religious conflicts there and what kind of ways they express themselves? I've been there many times, but I'm still mystified by it. So we'd love to get some guidance as I go.
You know, I grew up there. I go there every year 2 or 3 times, and I'm probably as mystified. The reason is that the Islam which I grew up with and which the majority of Pakistanis still follow is a very relaxed Islam. There has been an increasing ritualism added largely because of Ziaul Haq and his forced conversion of Muslims towards Islam, which is the only way of describing it, because he completely changed the curriculums in the schools. He gave mullahs a salary out of the zakat funds, which was a travesty against, because they're not supposed to be receiving that assistance, and put them on the dole. And then using divisions among the different groups, whether it is the Sunni and the Shia, or with, you know, the Deobandi versus the Barelvi. And then even within the Deobandi and the Barelvi, you have sub-schools who take themselves so seriously that they believe that, you know, the other person is not a Muslim, as an apostate. And since they are now extremely well armed and have financial support, which is based on popular contributions from within the country and from the Gulf and private sources in Saudi Arabia, they have become fairly autonomous. They are non-state actors, and they really hold the key to India-Pakistan conflict, because another Mumbai attack or an attack on the US, like Faisal Shehzad's, if it succeeds, the consequences are going to be terrible. Yes, ma'am.
It's interesting to hear you mention Ambassador Marco, because I actually studied with him as an undergraduate. But I was curious to hear your thoughts on the Pakistan People's Party and Benazir Bhutto, and to know if there was any discussion still going on about her, if there is really, you think, a legacy of hers. Is she still discussed and remembered, or is she just sort of, has the party sort of moved on, and is there, do you think that she'll have any lasting influence?
I think she will always have a place in Pakistani history, as did her father. But not all of it will be very positive, because there were many missed opportunities during her rule too. And the corruption that was introduced during her first and her second regimes will always be mentioned. However, she represented a certain symbolism as a woman, as a leader of a Muslim country, and certainly for her strength in fighting against military rule. She will be remembered. I don't see a vision in the current Pakistan People's Party, and certainly no reference to a vision either. There is often a reference to the memory of Benazir Bhutto, or Shaheed Mohtarama Bhutto, as everyone refers to her, including her husband, and carrying her photograph, you know, from one podium to the other in international fora, is really not paying tribute to the kind of fight that she led against autocracy and dictatorship. So there isn't a vision. I think the party essentially is like any other party in Pakistan, trying to stay in power as long as it could, and taking advantage of the kind of rentier state which Pakistan has become, to benefit from privileged access to state resources, and attempts to buy bureaucrats, politicians, the army, whoever. And this essentially ends up creating a huge backlash, because with the advent of now a reasonably independent judiciary, which is another bright spot, perhaps too activist judiciary, and an emerging fourth estate, the broadcast media. There are 42 news channels in Pakistan, and almost all of them are ranting and raving against the government. And so there are exposés, there's all kinds of stuff. Not all of it is very responsible journalism, but it is emerging. And so what used to be, in the 90s, a troika of power between the president, the prime minister, and the army chief, and then became a pogo stick under Musharraf, because he was everything and unstable as a result, is now becoming a kind of a rickety four-legged stool, where you have the prime minister and the president fighting for space on one side, the army chief, the chief justice, and then you have the media emerging as a force. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that I understand that it was really provided support to people who were devastated, and there are lackluster support because the government is not responding. Is this accurate? And if so, why is the government responding?
The insurgent groups, and specifically the Jamaat al-Dawa, which is the social services arm of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, were located in the Swat, Malakand, that northern area, and they were there in the earthquake of 2005 also. So they were quite often first responders. The flood-affected area in central and southern Punjab is also home to these groups. This is where their recruitment base is. So they were there too. But the reports of their activities have been exaggerated predominantly by Western media, because the largest quantum of assistance was provided by the military. They were the first responders in most cases. They had the wherewithal to do it. And the civilians failed because after the earthquake, they actually commissioned a national disaster response plan. And it took 5 years to be produced. And it's a very comprehensive document. I've read every page of 182 pages of the document. Even talked about the strong possibility of floods, what would need to be done, how to prepare for it. It was released under the Prime Minister's signature with an introduction that said, I hope these will be implemented. And it reminded me of Secretary of State George Shultz, who proclaimed at a State Department meeting that hope is not a policy. So nothing was done at the federal level or to get the provinces involved in preparing for it. Yes, the groups were active, but the quantum of assistance they provided is a very small proportion of the total assistance that was provided. In fact, a recent study by Tahir Andrabi and someone else for the World Bank of the earthquake relief effort shows that their exploits were exaggerated, that the vast assistance came from the NGOs and the military at that time. Let me just move to this side so they don't feel that I'm ignoring this side, please.
You began by talking about a coming economic crisis with possible dire consequences. Could you elaborate on that and say what the scenario might look like?
If they don't take a serious attempt at cutting expenditures, if they don't improve tax administration, because lost revenues are a huge part of their problem. If they don't convince their partners in the coalition to approve the reformed general sales tax, and if they don't convince their provincial partners to approve the reformed general sales tax on the services component, which hasn't gone to Parliament, they're not going to have the resources domestically to survive. And they will resort to deficit financing, and so you will have a breaching of all targets with the IMF. The IMF money will dry up. When the IMF money dries up, the target is 4.7%, I think, and it may end up close to 4.2%, may end up at 7% of GDP. That's going to be disastrous. And if the IMF stops giving money to Pakistan, then many of the World Bank structural adjustment loans are tied to the IMF. International banks then start giving Pakistan a hard time. You can't raise money internationally. If they go to deficit financing, inflation will increase. And that will create serious unrest in the cities, particularly, because the poorest are the ones that are surviving on $1 a day or $2 a day. Those people spend more than half their income on food. And food prices already have risen as much as 50% in some cases. So general inflation is now around 20%. And inflation is absolutely the worst kind of tax you can impose on any society.
So could you just say where would the domestic unrest lead, potentially?
Well, it would lead to a challenge of the government. And if the government is unable to quell it, there will be again, unfortunately, Groundhog Day for Pakistan, a demand for the military to step in, to have a caretaker government. The Bangladesh model is mentioned, all kinds of things which have failed. But people will say, look, we have to have something other than the current situation. So it's very critical to do what the US is trying to do, which is to strengthen the civilian administration, give them the confidence that they can and should take action, and that there are friends that will reward that behavior. But they somehow cannot seem to focus on it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned nuclear capability as we really discussed it. In a country of some insurgency, it must be a very scary thing. I wonder if you can tell us something about that issue. And one more. You mentioned Indian interest in Afghanistan. Is this just as a counter to Pakistani influence, or are there other interests?
I think it's part of a broader Indian strategy to have economic relations with Afghanistan and Central Asia. But India needs to understand also that if it is to compete with China, it will need every ounce of energy. And that energy can only come from Central Asia, and if it comes from Central Asia and Iran, it has to come through Pakistan. So there has to be what Peter Jones at the University of Ottawa calls a show of strategic altruism on the part of India to Pakistan, to somehow normalize relationships in such a way that they don't need to be each other's best friends, but they don't have to be best enemies either. On the nuclear side, if you're talking of safeguarding nuclear assets, I think there's fairly broad international consensus that Pakistan has now learned enough to safeguard those to the extent that it's humanly possible. Even in the United States, we've allowed an armed nuclear bomb to fly across the country, so things could happen. But Pakistan has demated its weapons, so even if one of its facilities somehow falls to an insurgent group, they would have to get the other half of the weapon in order to get a complete weapon. There are 3 perimeters, according to most descriptions, and there's dedicated army of 10,000 persons whose sole job is to protect these assets in these 3 concentric circles around all these sites. That's the theory, but people can penetrate perimeters we don't know. The IISS, which has the last published assessment, called it robust, the system of security of Pakistan's nuclear assets. So that's about all one can say. Yes?
I was wondering what areas of peacekeeping you think it seems unlikely that social spending in the aftermath of the floods will be touched, and it seems equally unlikely the military will finish. So where exactly do you see
military spending can be cut. It's a question of working it out with the military so that they understand the critical need. Because if you take away debt servicing and defense spending, I think Pakistan is left with about 13 or 16 cents of the dollar for everything else. And even that is badly spent. Also, if you create an enabling environment, you can bring in foreign direct investment. So you can increase your earnings. And actually, one of the bright spots throughout all these travails of the international economy and Pakistan's own economy has been Pakistanis themselves. Remittances from workers in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in North America, in Britain, are at a record level. I think they peaked at about $16 billion a year, and then they went down, and now they're up to about 12 plus billion this year. So when you compare that with Kerry Lugar, which is 7.5 billion over 5 years, in 1 year, Pakistanis who are at the lower end of the social and economic strata send back to Pakistan over $12 billion. So you can actually encourage inflows of investment and financing even before you get the military to start cutting back drastically. Yes.
There have been some rumblings that from Pervez Musharraf that he might be planning a return, and he's founded his party in exile. Is this is it realistic that he would, upon return, have any sort of welcome except for an arrest? And if so, could this shake up the political scene at all?
Actually, I hosted him a couple of days ago at the South Asia Center, and if you're interested, you may want to go to our website, acus.org, and see the interaction. This was my very first question to him. I knew that he'd read a piece I'd written saying that there was no way he was going to be able to go back. There are very good reasons for that. In addition to the ones you mentioned, he's going to be arrested for sure when he goes back on charges that he escaped when he resigned. The Chief Justice is not going to let him go. He's going to be under attack by the Tehreek-e-Taliban and their affiliates in Pakistan. He doesn't have the protection he had when he was president. So there's physical danger, which is very unfortunate, but it's there. He doesn't have a political party. He's announced it. And then there are very strong legal constitutional issues because the election for presidency in Pakistan is an indirect election where the members of the provincial assemblies, the National Assembly and the Senate all vote. And he doesn't have a single person in any of these bodies. So it's not likely that he's going to have anyone or cobble together a coalition with enough force to elect him to president. But strange things have happened in Pakistan. I mean, if you had asked anyone in the fall of 2008, when Benazir Bhutto in October was planning to go back to Pakistan, that Asif Ali Zardari would be the president of Pakistan, you would have been laughed out of court. So, I don't know. I do know that within the military, the people that I've talked to do not, and historically have never gone back to supporting an ex-chief. And they don't feel a great deal of affection for him because he is seen as having diminished the military professionally by civilianizing it, by getting it so involved with civilian matters that General Kiani, the first thing he did in the first year as army chief was declare 2008 the year of the soldier, and then 2009 was the year of training. So his whole aim is to try and get the army back to a professional footing. So General Musharraf really faces an uphill task. Let me go at the back over there. Yes.
One of the causes of Pakistanis' is statistical dislike for the American government.
What are the causes?
Yes, I mean, what are the factors that they...
In the recent past, the drone attacks have been a very major cause of that, and that is the responsibility for that rests a lot with the Pakistani government, because they accepted the drone attacks and yet publicly proclaimed that these were an invasion of Pakistan's sovereignty. I mean, I've seen proof of drones in the early days taking off from Pakistani airfields. And yet they continued to insist that the US was doing something terrible and it should stop. This has, over time, inflamed public opinion against the US. Then there is, as you know, the clash of narratives. Because of this kind of up and down relationship, there is a cumulative memory in Pakistan, even among kids who weren't born when the last contretemps occurred, who feel that the US always comes to Pakistan and uses Pakistan when it has a regional or a global interest. And once that's satisfied, it moves on. And so there is that. And on the US side, there is also a lack of acknowledgement of history and a desire to look at today's problems and let's solve them and move ahead. And you know, many of you are well versed in our culture and language, but in Urdu, the word for yesterday and tomorrow is exactly the same word, kal. So there's a continuum, which I use to illustrate this point to American audiences, which somehow escapes American decision makers. Because they feel, look, you know, forget the past, whatever happened, we acknowledge it was a mistake. But now, let's solve the problems and let's move ahead and you know, trust us, we will be with you. Till something else happens in Yemen or Somalia or whatever. That's never said. So there is this kind of history of distrust. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between the ISI and Lashkar-e-Taiba or other kind of sub-state groups and the tension within the security apparatus about whether to kind of engage in influence or to conflict directly.
Historically, the ISI, because it was, its remit was during the Soviet war to develop fighters to fight the Soviets, started developing its links with some of these groups. And after the Soviet war, when the insurgency developed inside Kashmir, they saw an opportunity to redirect the efforts of these groups. And they chose these groups to equip and train them to fortify the Kashmiri resistance inside Indian-administered Kashmir. And they used this asymmetric approach because there was no way Pakistan could, on a conventional basis, counter India. The nuclear deterrence was always there, but there was a notion that this would allow Pakistan to gain some leverage in negotiations with India. That has not succeeded. And then, as I said, when Pervez Musharraf pushed back these groups, essentially they were let go. And they, by that time, had become independent. And they have their collection centers and boxes and shops all over Pakistan, where people actually drop cash. And at the time of the Eid festivals, the Eid al-Fitr and the Eid al-Adha, they raise a lot of money, particularly in the Eid that just occurred yesterday, where they collect skins from sacrificed animals. And those are valuable. I mean, they have value. And that's how they increase their resources. They've now become fairly autonomous. And they've actually challenged the military in certain areas. Not the Lashkar-e-Taiba so much as the other groups around them. But the Lashkar has managed to co-opt into its ranks any number of ex-ISI handlers who have given it the heft and the training that they need and the tradecraft in handling fairly complex operations like Mumbai. Who would have thought that they would have been able to do this with boats and GPSs and with kids who were country bumpkins with 18 months of training and put them in a pair of cargo pants and send them off to Mumbai and for 3 days they basically held India hostage. So they're now flexing their muscles. I think this is a very dangerous trend. And it's not going to be possible for the Pakistan military, but I think it's still possible for other ways of changing the environment from where these people are emerging. I mean, Pakistan needs to create 2 million jobs a year just to stay abreast of its demographic shift. It has a median age of 18, so 90 million people are below 18. The vast majority of them don't go to school. And so they're going to be looking for somebody to feed them and clothe them. And there's an opportunity there, I think. Yes.
So would you say General Kayani has firm control over the ISI, or does the ISI sometimes operate independently?
The ISI never operates independently. I'll say that categorically. The ISI always does what the government of Pakistan or the power center in Pakistan tells it to do. I use my words carefully because sometimes there's a division of power between the civilian and the military side. And there have been times when the ISI head has reported more to the Prime Minister than to the Army Chief. The period when my late brother Asif was the Army Chief, there was a division between him and the government, and the ISI head was appointed by the Prime Minister and was more inclined to report to the Prime Minister. Today, although technically the ISI chief reports to the Prime Minister, the reality is that because of the war and the insurgency, and because he was the Director General Military Operations and a very close affiliate of General Kiani, General Pasha and General Kiani are on the same page. There is no way that the ISI would go off on a tangent and do its own things, which is not to say that it will not act autonomously, but it will inform the army when it's doing things, because I think there's enough confidence between the two individuals that Pasha can act on its own.
Well, if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking our speaker again.